Okay, perfect. Okay, so to say a little bit about myself, I'm Daisy Diaz-Strong. I'm at the Jane Addams College of Social Work at UIC, and I am on the Governing Council of SSEA and co-chairing the webinars committee. Again, today we have Jennifer, Nate, and Royale. I'm going to do a more formal introduction so you can know a little bit about them through their bio, and then I will go ahead and pass it off to them. As you have questions during the presentation, please go ahead and put them in the chat. When the presenters are done, we will go ahead and open it up and you can unmute yourself if you'd like and share your question, or I can read them off from the chat. All right, so let me go ahead and introduce our speakers. So first we have Jennifer Geiger. Jennifer is an associate professor at the Jane Addams College of Social Work at the University of Illinois, Chicago. So she is my colleague. Dr. Geiger earned her MSW and her PhD from Arizona State University. She has extensive practice and research experience related to students in post-secondary settings with foster care histories, including working as a child welfare specialist and developing and leading campus programs for foster care youth at Arizona State University and UIC. She has published over 40 peer-reviewed journal articles, 7 book chapters, and 3 books. She also works with several local and national advisory groups. We also have Royale Johnson, who's an associate professor of education and social work at the University of Southern California. Dr. Johnson is a nationally recognized expert on issues of educational access, racial equity, and student success. His work has an unapologetic focus on Black and institutionally marginalized populations. He has published over 60 academic publications, including 3 books. And his forthcoming book, so I'll make a note of this.
Yep, that's great.
To anybody who's, make sure to mute yourselves, please, when you come in. Okay, so the forthcoming book, make a note of it, is From Foster Care to College, Navigating Challenges and Creating Possibilities, which will be published this fall by Teachers College Press. Dr. Johnson holds a master's in educational policy studies from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign and a PhD in higher education and student affairs from the Ohio State University. And last but not least, we have Nate Oakpitch. He's an associate professor at the University of Connecticut School of Social Work. He studies the transition to adulthood for youth with foster care backgrounds, focusing on factors, policies, and programs aimed at increasing college access and success. Dr. Oakpitch earned his PhD from the Crown Family School of Social Work Policy and Practice at the University of Chicago. He holds several master's degrees in biostatistics and epidemiology, social work, and also clinical psychology. His research is informed by his professional experience providing mental health services to youth in residential, school, and community settings, as well as working several years in college residence life. With that, I'm going to go ahead and pass it off to our speakers.
Thank you, Daisy. Let me go ahead and pull up our PowerPoint here as we get started. This lovely banner is always up here. What's going on here? Here we go. I'll say good day because I know folks are kind of all in these different time zones. It could be morning, it could be afternoon, it could be night. But we're really excited to be here today. I'm joined by some of my favorite colleagues, my favorite people. I see some familiar faces and names here, and we're excited to talk to you today about the research and policy context for emerging adults with foster care backgrounds as they pursue and navigate post-secondary education. So we'll talk about some of the research, what's known about their experiences before college, while they're in college, some of the barriers and promoters to getting there, and throughout their experiences, as well as providing a context for the policies and practices and programs that have been implemented, and just share some ideas about going forward, about some suggestions and ideas we have about improving some of those outcomes and experiences for this subgroup of emerging adulthood. So I'll pass it over to Nate.
Great, thanks, Jen. Again, thanks everyone for joining us on this Friday morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on where you are. So I'm just going to be giving an overview of youth with experience in foster care, some of their education outcomes, and then federal policies that are specifically designed to impact their secondary and post-secondary education outcomes. So youth with experience in foster care, while they're in care, the state assumes responsibility for their well-being. A lot of them enter foster care due to reasons of maltreatment, right? This is after being separated from their family. And there's been attention in recent years specifically to older adolescents and young adults who are in foster care, especially those who may not be able to be reunified with their family or exit through adoption or guardianship. These young people may age out of care. Next. So as the case for all youth, education is really important for youth with experience in foster care. While they are school age, it's legally mandated, and it also aligns with youth's experience, youth's aspirations. So when we ask young people with experience in foster care, when they're about 17 years old, what's as far as you would like to go in terms of education? Clearly across studies, we've seen this in several studies, at least 80% or more say they aspire to go to college. Most of them aspire to finish college. Next. Historically, as a kind of distinct population, youth with experience in foster care really became got prominence from the research community and practice community in the 1980s, mostly at first through research with child welfare scholars, a lot of qualitative studies, some quantitative studies. And since then, beginning in the late 1990s, early 2000s, there have been several large longitudinal studies that gave kind of a longitudinal look at their transition out of foster care and into adulthood. And really in the last 20 years, there's been a big take-up from scholars across many disciplines in public policy, in education, in psychology, and so forth, to just focus on this population in terms of research, policy, and practice. And as I'll talk about in a few slides, there are many federal policies that specifically directed to supporting educational success for youth experiencing foster care. All right, so just to give you a sense of numbers, on a given day, there are about 128,000 youth who are 13 years or older in the United States who are in foster care. Age 13 is important because in terms of completing the FAFSA, right, for college education, one of the key questions is, were you in foster care on your 13th birthday or after? And we see also several of the policies that I'll talk about later. Eligibility starts to kick in not at age 13, then a little bit later, 14, 16, so forth. We also see racial disparities. Black youth and Native American youth are overrepresented in foster care. This is also true among older youth in care. Next. And then each year, about 20,000 youth age out of care, which means they reach their state's foster care age limit without having achieved permanency. Currently, in most states, in about 4/5 of the states, youth are allowed to stay in care up to their 21st birthday. However, there's a small handful of states where on their 18th birthday, they have to leave care. So in total, about 20,000 youth age out because they reached their state's age limit. Now, when these young people leave care, they don't necessarily have family support to rely on. A lot of them are still grappling with the effects of trauma, repeated relational loss. So this includes being separated from their family. Typically, they experience several placement moves while in foster care. Many also experience moving schools. There's also a lot of turnover in child welfare workforce, which means it's also another source of relational disruption. And many of them are in pretty dire financial situations. So they're, at the cusp of being homeless, losing their home, losing their assets. Next. And some youth with experience in foster care, they do have positive transitions despite these odds. However, as would be the case with any youth, many face significant challenges that impede their success in school and work in other areas of their life. Next. All right, so just to give you a sense of college aspirations, enrollment rates, completion rates, these are results from a large longitudinal study called the Midwest study. It included a representative sample of 17-year-olds in foster care in 3 Midwestern states. And let's say we took 100 young people in the Midwest study, and we asked them, how far do you want to go in school? Next. What we saw is that about 84 out of 100 say they aspire to go to college. Next. However, by the time they're in their mid-20s, only about 40 of the 100 will have actually enrolled in college. Next. And probably most startling is that only 8 out of 100 will have earned a 2-year college degree or 4-year college degree by their mid-20s. Next. So let's take that 8% youth from the Midwest study, and how does that compare to the national average? Next. Well, about 46% of youth in the same age group have completed a 2-year degree or 4-year degree. So youth in care are more than 5 times, the rate of college completion is about 5 times less than that of the general youth population. Next. So just a quick snapshot of some educational outcomes looking across several studies. So in terms of high school completion or GED completion, studies estimate that between about 70 to 85% of youth with experience in foster care complete a high school or GED. Nationwide, drawing on data from the Census Bureau of youth between the ages of 25 and 29, the rate's about 95%. So there's some gap there. Next. Now, in terms of enrolling in college, there's a pretty big range based on several studies for youth experienced foster care, anywhere from 29% to as high as 64% enroll in college. The studies on the low end, they tend to only track college up to age 21. And we know that if we track the outcome a little bit later, those rates would go up. However, what we do know is that most of the young people with experience in care who do go to college wind up enrolling in 2-year colleges, at least at first. So the 29 to 64% compared to nationwide, it's about 70% for the general population. And in terms of college completion, we're looking at 2-year degree or higher. It's about 8 to 11% for youth with experiences in foster care, compared to about 46% of 25 to 29-year-olds nationwide. Next. Okay, so let's, I'll finish up with just giving a high-level overview of some policies that were specifically targeted at youth with experience in foster care that are meant to impact their post-secondary education, either directly or in some form. So first important law was the 1999 Foster Care Independence Act. This followed a few smaller federal laws. And what this did was it set aside $140 million each year that was allocated to states based on their foster care enrollment. And what this did was it funded independent living services. There were 13 different service areas. A few of them included education, such as tutoring, funding for post-secondary education. And states have a lot of flexibility in how they use these funds. It also mandated a data collection system be developed for youth with experience in foster care. This is called the National Youth and Transition Database, or NYTD, and it was launched in 2011. And every 3 years, there's a new cohort of 17-year-olds in foster care that are interviewed at age 17, 19, and 21. So we have a pretty good picture of the transition to adulthood for these young people. 2001, the 1999 law was amended to create the Education and Training Voucher Program. This gives youth up to $5,000 per year that could be used towards post-secondary education. What's one of the downsides? Well, the amount was $5,000 in 2021. Guess what the amount is today? You can get up to $5,000. Yet the cost of college increased by quite a lot since then. That's one of the downsides of the program. Next major piece of legislation is the 2007 College Cost Reduction Act. And this allowed youth who were in care on or after their 13th birthday to file as an independent student on their FAFSA form. And this is important because this opens up potentially a lot more aid that they're eligible for, especially need-based aid such as Pell Grants. Next. 2008 Fostering Connections. This was a watershed child welfare law because it didn't just add money to provide services to youth, but it fundamentally changed the age limit at which youth can stay in foster care. This is optional for states. States could opt in or opt out of this program. And but what it did is for states that opted in, they could provide federally funded foster care up to youth's 21st birthday. Before this, it was only up to age 18. So it added 3 critical years where young people could stay in care. Youth had to meet one of 5 eligibility criteria to participate in extended foster care. 2 of them involved education, right? Either working towards a high school credential or pursuing post-secondary education. Next. Also in 2008, there was a reauthorization of the Higher Education Opportunities Act. And this rendered youth with experience in foster care to be automatically eligible for TRIO programs. So programs such as student support services. Next. And then finally, the 2018 Family First Prevention Services Act. Most of this law was focused on preventing maltreatment, but it also had some provisions that spoke specifically to youth with experience in foster care. And essentially what it did was it extended age limits of the ETV program and the services under the FCIA law. Next. So in addition to these federal policies, I'll just preview this because I know my colleagues are going to talk about this more. There's many state policies that have also been passed that target young people in care, such as state tuition and fee waivers for youth with experience in foster care, and also liaisons on college campuses. And just one quick note, you may notice that a lot of these laws really target the financial well-being of young people, like connecting young people to funds or allowing them to apply for more funds. Where there's more need is for really good intensive services, federal funding for really good intensive services, in addition to the Foster Care to Independence Act. And I'll pass it along to Jen or Ariel. I'm not sure who's going next.
It's me.
All
Thanks,
right.
Nate.
Mhm.
So Nate's kind of set the stage for kind of creating this better understanding of foster care, what many of these young people, young adults, emerging adults are experiencing as they transition from that adolescence phase into that kind of like early adulthood phase. So I think it's important to situate ourselves in understanding that developmental period. And many of us can kind of reflect on what that experience was like for us as we were, barely maybe trying to get through high school and thinking about what our options were. And a lot of that is highly dependent on our own families and our own experiences in terms of what our options might be, what our awareness of those options might be, and how we then forge a path for ourselves through that process. So thinking about too, how reliant we are on our parents or our caregivers to be able to support us not only financially, but emotionally, physically in a lot of ways to be able to get there. So I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of that pre-college phase and thinking about what are some of the supports, some of the barriers that young people experience as they navigate this particular period in getting to college, to better understand then what some of the supports are once they are able to get to college as well. So there are a number of barriers that have been identified in the research. A lot of them center on these different kind of domains around social and emotional support, navigating the enrollment process, the college system itself, and just kind of like wrapping our brains around that. And then as Nate pointed out, some of the policies that address some of those issues around finances, employment, which are very typical of this particular period of development as well. So thinking about the social and emotional support, what we know is that these young people, as they transition or begin to start to think about college and employment opportunities, many of them are really grappling with that decision, right? So they've been involved with this state sanctioned system for many of them quite a long time. We know young people who age out have typically been in the foster care system for some time. And many of them just kind of want to be done with these systems, right? And they are thinking, how do I best support myself? And their options are to go to school, these different types of school and training options, but then also thinking about going to work and having that paycheck, right? That sometimes can seem much more desirable than going to school after being in school for so long. But then they also may not have these adults around them. So whether those are professionals or other folks that are around them who have knowledge about what this process might look like, knowing what their options might be, and then again, how to begin to address some of those options and think about what they might be. And on the flip side of that, maybe these young people are getting on campus and starting to ask questions, but folks who are in high school settings and college settings may not be aware of some of those challenges or the specific needs that these young people might have, and therefore don't know what sort of options financially and otherwise supports on campus that they might have. And furthermore, our young people are maybe managing some difficult family or peer relationships. We know oftentimes when young people leave the foster care system, many of them do go back to their family of origins, which may mean moving, which may mean engaging again in relationships that maybe haven't been tended to in the last couple of years. And as Nate mentioned earlier, many are dealing with untreated mental health challenges or traumatic experiences that can impede their ability to make decisions around post-secondary education options. And many of us know who've gone through this process of applying to college. Maybe you've done it also for your own children or other family members. Thinking about just what goes into applying to college itself, or multiple colleges, or different community colleges, trade programs, or other vocational programs. You have to have paperwork, you have to have documentation, forms, ID, and a lot of young people in care don't have people to help them obtain the right documentation or verification to be able to access some of the programs that might benefit them, but also to just make sure all those boxes are checked when they're accessing post-secondary education. We know too from the research that many young people don't want to share their identity of being in care. And that is something that completely understandable, right? But that also could then impedes their ability to access some of the services that might be available to them. And then again, just this part of the navigating the system is finding out all of the pieces, right? If you've had your housing, your room and board, all of those things taken care of for so long, it's really hard to then start thinking about like, where do I want to live? What can I afford? What are some of, what is a safe and affordable space that I can be in? How am I going to pay for everything? All of those things, not just tuition, but again, the room and board, food, extracurricular, all of those things, supplies. How do I pay for all of those things? And then, trying to find my way around college campuses. I still have a hard time giving people directions around college campuses because you don't know buildings' name. They don't have street names on campus. Some campuses are smaller, some are larger, and just it's a new space. It's a different space than a lot of folks are oftentimes used to. So that can be a challenge. Now, there's oftentimes limited access or disruption in affordable healthcare and housing, right? So, a lot of times when young people turn 18, they are having to change providers. Their medical insurance coverage changes. If they're moving, just geographically, those options might change. And seeking out a new provider can be really challenging. We know on college campuses, there are services available, but there could be a wait time when it comes to our mental health services, getting medication that we might need, those kinds of things, as well as housing, given the rising costs of housing. We also have to think about the cost of dorms and things like that. Finally, financial and employment. What we know from the research too is there's going to be gaps. There's all these different services like Nate talked about in terms of providing those financial resources, but the way that they're structured oftentimes are not helpful to young people as they move through college. So there's oftentimes a gap, and big or small, that gap can be something that prevents them from enrolling and prevents them from being able to persist and be successful in school. Many are don't necessarily have that luxury of being able to not work at all, right? So they choose to work, whether that's on or off campus, and the hours start to build up, which oftentimes interferes with all the other responsibilities that go along with being in college. So there have been some, recognizing some of these needs, there are some pre-college interventions that have been successful in being able to recruit students, but then also be able to get students in a better position to be ready to enter college and continue to be successful, and then perhaps go on to some of those other programs that support them while they're in college. So there's a number of different, what we would call summer bridge programs, or even like a summer camp sort of a structure that either brings young people to campus that they've maybe committed to starting in the fall, having them start a couple of weeks early so they get moved in and acclimated to the campus and what some of the resources are there. And really that's the process of connecting them with each other, but also to these different resources, developing skills like study habits and time management, telling them where the library is, if people even still go to the library, the cafeterias, where can they get food, where are the classroom buildings, what is the transportation like on campus? So getting them kind of acclimated to some of those things instead of kind of dropping them off the weekend before, college starts, like what I did. Really good idea. And so they can kind of have a little bit of stability there as they still kind of navigate that process. There's also some high school programs where young people are kind of exposed to different campuses or different options. So they talk about, what are some of the options for them after they graduate from high school, and also just getting them to that end point of finishing high school successfully. This could include different sort of courses that they might take, field trips to the different campuses, meeting different people in those settings, having some of the testing kind of pre-organized and prep courses and things like that ahead of time, which is kind of the model for the First Star Academies that I also have listed on here. But there's also some really successful mentoring programs that, again, target young people in high school, and really kind of this one-on-one mentor that's assigned to these young adults and kind of assist them in all those different areas of life, whether it's academic, social, emotional development, different sort of supports to make sure that they're getting where they need to go and be successful as they transition into these post-secondary education settings. There's also focused prep programs. So an example I gave here is the Better Futures program. I believe it's up in Oregon, and they focus on young adults with mental health challenges. So there's different groups that kind of have more specificity in what their young people might need as they navigate this developmental period. And then also the National Social Work Program is also an example of a program that's in Alabama that does something similar to in terms of leadership and readiness and getting students to get excited and get ready for that college experience. Pass it over to you, Rael.
Okay, so I want to start first with some of the barriers and challenges that show up for students as they are entering college, many of which start at the pre-college stage, right? So stigma, marginalization, and unbelonging. We know that stigma around one's identity, being a young person in foster care, often comes with all sorts of low expectations, negative assumptions about why one was placed in foster care, and the stigma around that sort of shapes how one experiences campus, their likelihood to build interpersonal relationships that would otherwise be supportive. And stigma is not just at the interpersonal level, it's at the structural level, right, as well. So students having to identify themselves in many ways for services that would be able to support them, but because of the stigma and fear around associating, some of them do not, right? That contributes to feelings of marginalization, unbelonging. And when students don't feel like they belong, they're more likely to disengage from the campus. Another issue being around family privilege. I think we take for granted how much of what we do in higher education is normed on students who come from traditionally family backgrounds. I remember being a student at the University of Illinois and having mom and dad's weekends, right? And the traditions, the activities, and so forth. So much of what we do is prioritize as students who come from traditional family backgrounds. So that makes it even more difficult for students to sort of identify with the campus community and culture. We know basic needs and security has been a hot button topic for higher education, but young people in foster care, particularly those who age out of the system, are most vulnerable to issues of housing insecurity, food insecurity, right? We think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, that first band being basic and psychological sort of needs. When students don't have the opportunity to meet their basic needs, that is a precursor to belonging and connections and other developmental outcomes that we know are important. And when we think about the pandemic, right? So many colleges and universities closed their doors at the height of the pandemic, creating a basic need and security for students who didn't have a quote unquote home to go to, leading to couch surfing and so forth. Academic help seeking is another issue that begins to show up at the K-12 level, but cascades into higher education. So one, it's about knowing that resources even exist and demystifying the use of those sources, resources as well. And then finally, trauma and mental health. There are a wide range of traumatic experience, one of which being placed in foster care, right? Any challenges that may be associated with why you were placed in foster care, these traumas intersect and they compound over time, and they have academic consequences, emotional, mental health consequences that shape how students experience the campus. Next slide. But there are some protective factors, right? Haas talks about turning points, these moments or events that are seemingly life-altering and put one on a different sort of developmental trajectory. Lots of studies have drawn on resiliency as a framework to understand not only the risks that students are exposed to, but the wide range of protective factors that play a role in their ability to overcome those risk factors, right? Some of this is at the individual level and thinking about some of the promising traits and characteristics of students. We know independence is really, really, really important to students. Having autonomy and be able to make agentic sort of decisions about their time and their use, so that the extent to which students are able to develop autonomy, the more efficacious they feel about their self, optimism, assertiveness. These are all sort of individual level traits that have been associated with positive educational outcomes. But if you think about resiliency through a more ecological framework, right, and broadening the aperture to include family, community level factors, right, having supportive adults, sometimes this takes form in the way of not fictive kin, but chosen family, right, that students make decisions about the wide network of initially friends and community members who become part of their chosen family, and they derive all sorts of inspiration, motivation, and instrumental forms of support to navigate. Student involvement on campus has been really important to students' sort of learning outcomes. And we know this generally from the higher education literature, like the students having opportunities to be involved in educationally purposeful activities that are linked to the learning and development mission of higher education yields enormous benefits for students. But there are challenges, right? Not all student involvement activities are equitably experienced and folks have access to them in the same sort of way. This is why campus support programs for young people in foster care have been so important. Next slide. So there have been like a rapid increase of these programs across the country. I know Jen has done a lot of work in this area and just sort of taking stock of their purpose, their different function, the scope, how they operate. You know, to one extent, it's great that these programs exist, because having a program that explicitly is designed to attend to your academic and social needs is important, but there's a lot of variation, right? There's not a lot of fidelity, and the implementation of these programs and resources are not always the same as well. But generally, these programs, in addition to providing a safe haven, a safe space for students to be, they provide very instrumental forms of support, having a go-to person that you can connect with to be an advocate for you in navigating a really unfamiliar place and territory can be really important. And from what we know from cursory studies, that there are some benefits associated with this, right? Beyond finding community and finding a safe space, students also tend to perform better in terms of retention and persistence towards their degree. Next slide. So going forward and opportunities, I'll turn it back to Jen.
Thank you, Rael. So related just to kind of what you were talking about here, the way of kind of we're kind of thinking about this is there's a lot of work to be done. You know, we've talked about some of the work that has been done, and we've seen a lot of growth here in the last 20 years in terms of the research base, but there's still work to be done. And related to some of these post-secondary education programs, right, access and retention programs, there's a lot of challenges in building the evidence base for effectiveness in these programs. As Rael mentioned, there isn't a lot of fidelity across the board in terms of how these programs are delivered, how they are received, how they're funded, all sorts of different things, the program elements. But it is important for us to be able to say, is this something that we're investing in? Is this something that's working? Is it benefiting students? And so on a smaller scale, it's important for us to assess whether it is beneficial to students in the long term to be able to offer these programs and deliver these programs. We need a better understanding of effective collaboration models across systems. That's thinking about child welfare, education, that's K through 12 and post-secondary education. How to work together, then also in collaboration with community organizations that are supporting these groups as well. I think there's opportunities for different committees and coalitions and folks who are working towards the same sort of end goal in supporting these young people in these settings. So the more knowledge we have, the better we can work together in these different models. We need to have more research on policies that Nate talked about earlier that impact post-secondary education. So it's great that we do have these policies that then provide financial support for young people, but a lot of times we don't know if they're being used, if the amount of money that's allocated is significant, is sufficient in order for students to be able to benefit from them. So we need some more information and more research done on these different types of policies at the state and federal level. But an area that we really know very little about is our knowledge of financial aid access and use. How are young people accessing these financial aid benefits? And how are they packaging them to best serve them in the long run to pay for tuition and other educational expenses? Again, broadening our understanding of experiences and outcomes for diverse students. As Nate mentioned, we do have some longitudinal databases that exist, but a lot of times there isn't a focus on some more diverse subgroups of students. And we'll share some resources at the end of the webinar. One of the some new articles that have come out in the last year, Rael and I co-edited a special issue on this topic, and we did include some articles in that special issue that focus on different groups, for example, Black college students, women in particular, sexual and gender minority students. So, those are some areas that we didn't have a whole lot of knowledge about what young people's experiences were in college. And we have a little bit more insight there. We don't know a lot about two-year colleges or vocational programs that students are engaging in. We've, focused a lot on four-year colleges, as we mentioned earlier. We know that a larger proportion of students with foster care experiences are going into community college settings or two-year college settings. So we need to know a little bit more about what their experiences are, what the outcomes are there as well. We do have some longitudinal data, but I think that there's definitely some area for improvement there in terms of how we're asking the questions, what questions we're asking to get a better sense of some of those numbers in terms of outcomes and experiences. And again, just looking at these different data systems, I think I mentioned to improve the variables and linking data sets across these different systems can be really helpful to us too, to get a better picture of what's going on. And feel free, any co-presenters, if you want to jump in on any of these, feel free to. I'm happy to keep going, but if you want to also add to or talk about them as well. Okay, I guess I'll go. So in terms of policies, there's definitely, again, some areas for improvement. Again, on a kind of a state level, but also on a federal level. We need to increase the financial support for students. So again, we haven't seen a whole lot of change in the amount that's allocated for ETVs, for example, and support for independent living programs and things like that. So make sure that we're, looking at what those numbers are and making them kind of bring them up to date in terms of what, students are actually needing. Expand access to tuition waivers. When Nate and I worked on a study that looked at tuition waivers and and looking at the outcomes related to that. What we found is that a lot of programs across the country aren't open to all students with foster care experience, and that's a barrier for a number of students as well. How the legislation around tuition waivers is written as well. For example, here in Illinois, it's written that students have to exhaust all these other options before they can tap into the tuition waiver. And to me, that's not a tuition waiver. That's kind of like an add-on at the end. And a lot of times these tuition waivers are unfunded mandates as part of legislation, which is, again, not very helpful to students. So expanding access to tuition waivers, education training vouchers, grants, and scholarships, taking a closer look at those to see how we can improve. Thinking about those non-traditional paths, making sure that we're honoring student choice. Four-year colleges are not for everybody. So we have to think about what some of those different options are and making sure that we're presenting all those different options to young people and thinking about the policies that come around some of those student choices. How do we then support them? Thinking about students who are part-time or full-time or who are, enrolling later. If we only have some of these programs that benefit students until they're 23, but they don't enroll until they're 22 or 23, that's not very helpful to them. So I think that's another way that we can better support our students with foster care experience. Comprehensive support and extended foster care programming, make sure that these are much more robust and consistent programs. It's great that our states have this program to be able to allow young people to stay in care longer, to provide that extra support. But if it's not support that's helpful to them, then it's just extra time that they're spending in care and maybe getting some extra financial support while they're there. So taking a closer look at that so we can bolster those supports as well. Something I hear all the time from students is that they're asking, application for this and application for that, and checking this box and verifying this and all that. It seems to me that it would make a lot of sense for us to streamline some of those application and enrollment processes for young people, whether that's done at the state level, institutional level, but having a consensus about what that process looks like so that we can make things easier for people who are trying to do something instead of putting some additional barriers in front of them that don't need to be there. And finally, creating a student data dashboard. This again would allow us to capture data around how are we doing around some of these things. So on whether that's on a state level or a local level, thinking about how can we be better about organizing and managing the data so we know how things are working. Anything to add, Nate or Royal there?
Yeah, what's one thing I would just add about ETVs. So in principle, ETVs are available to all older youth in care who meet certain requirements. Usually there are age requirements. There's a 10-state study that was done not too long ago that looked at among youth who are eligible for ETVs, how many actually got one, and it was about 37%. So we're talking about 1 in 3 youth who are eligible for an ETV actually receive an ETV. So it's definitely, I think, and part of that has to do with barriers to receiving ETVs. Some states make it very easy to apply. Other states, it's almost like $5,000 worth of work just to get the $5,000. It's really, really cumbersome processes.
Yeah, the only thing I'll just add is just that we need better coordination across sectors, right? So there are folks who are working in education on behalf of these issues and these youth, but also in the child welfare services, but we're often not talking to each other. Certainly our data is not linked and we don't have capacity to really even connect it in those ways. But I just find that, what was the last, every student succeeds at ESSA included a requirement that social workers will work with local education agencies to reduce school mobility issues, right? That, I think that is a promising example of the ways in which we need policy interventions that require more strategic collaboration and coordination to support post-secondary outcomes.
Yeah, and that leads to kind of thinking about the programs and practice, right? And so what we're actually doing on the ground. And I think there are some opportunities for that cross-system collaboration and training, right? So it's a lot of times we have our kind of areas of expertise when it comes to child welfare or higher education or K through 12, and we don't think about how do we start talking to each other about how we can use and leverage some of those resources, right? So there's some opportunities for training and support for campus professionals and some of those supportive adults to have a better idea of what this process is, or at least have them that, you know, they don't need to know everything, but they can at least know who they can contact or who they could reach out to get that information. Making sure that our pre-college and campus support programs are available to students, that they're comprehensive, that they're not only meeting, you know, the academic needs of students on campus, but also meeting their needs in terms of their mental health, their physical health, their social needs, those sort of things. And making sure that mentoring and consistent support is part of that planning process and preparation for these different sort of post-secondary options. Contact information up here, I can drop that in the chat too during the Q&A. And then we also had some resources too that I'm happy to share.
Thank you so much, Jennifer, Nate, and Royale. That was really helpful information, very informative to think about. I mean, that number of how many actually graduate is really stark. And then to think about, you know, the barriers to enrolling and then completing college, it makes some sense, but it's still really difficult to think about. For any questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat, or you can unmute yourself and ask any questions that you have. But I'll get it started. Again, that 8% that complete, you know, is really stark. And I'm wondering how that looks across racial lines or maybe gender, or if we have any information about other marginalized identities. And then along with that, in thinking about the barriers, what additional considerations should we be thinking about when it comes to, again, sort of like, you know, you talked about Black youth being overrepresented in the child welfare system. You talked about that co-edited volume with sexual and gender minorities. Any additional considerations to think about in terms of the barriers to post-secondary education?
Well, I think just the one thing to start out with is that I'm working with a team right now that's doing a systematic review on secondary completion, post-secondary access, and post-secondary completion for youth with experience in foster cares. And one of the things we've been looking at specifically is, you know, do studies report differences by race and ethnicity? Yeah. And I think the first, you know, big thing is that not many studies do. So we don't have a lot of information. What we have found though is, well, first off, in terms of gender, usually it's measured as a binary in most studies, and we find that students who identify as female tend to have higher enrollment rates, completion rates than males. And in terms of race and ethnicity, we don't, from the studies that exist, we didn't see the same, many of the same disparities that we see kind of in the general population. So we don't see significant differences, for example, lower rates for Black youth than white youth. We do see higher rates for Asian youth than other groups in terms of college completion. I think that does not mean that there aren't differential experiences that we really need to explore. And also the data that we have right now is there's not that many studies. So I think we need to really dig into that and make it a regular norm that if we're looking at outcomes, we look at them by differences in students' demographics.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. Another question that came up for me was, you talked about the data only goes up to, did you enroll, and it's kind of up to age 21. And then we are missing a lot of that. Well, what happens if you enroll later? Which to me, it would make sense that maybe there would be delayed enrollment, right? But that they would maybe come back at some point. And so I'm just curious, is there any data, or do you have any sense of whether there might be enrollment that happens later?
I was just going to defer to you, Nate, to see if you could talk about Cal Youth around some of the data that goes up a little bit
A little bit further, yeah.
in age. Yeah.
So it's in general, the age that young people first enroll, this is from a previous study, the Midwest study. The average age that youth first enrolled was, I believe, right around 20 years old. Some younger, some definitely older, up into the, mid-20s or later. There is most of the young people do enroll in their late teenage years, early 20s, but still later than their peers without foster care experience. And as you mentioned, part of that is from just gaps in education, right? In the past, school placement changes, missing school, they may be held back a year because of that, right? They may have to work a year, try to sort things out, figure things out before they can apply and they're ready to enroll. So a whole bunch of reasons. And for the most part, most young people do enroll in late teens, early 20s. There's still about a fifth, a sixth of young people that enroll after that into, well into their 20s.
Okay.
What I'll
Thank
just
you.
add is, there's a policy implication here, right? So the National Center for Education and Statistics, NCES, which is through the Department of Education, we have a suite of surveys existing that we track students longitudinally across the lifespan, but currently there aren't sufficient sort of indicators and categories to be able to identify young people in foster care. So as we think about advocacy, as we think about elections and being able to sort of advocate for this being included in the discourse, there's an opportunity, I think.
Yeah, that's a really important point. Thank you. I'm just going to read here in the chat from Jennifer Conley. From the presentation, there are many sources of funding for these youth if they want to attend post-secondary education. Do you know how many of these get some? Well, do you know how many of these get some of these financial supports?
Sometimes, as Nate indicated with, there was a recent study. So, 2023, a study of, ETV, and there was from a select number of states, right, Nate? I think it was like 10 states. And they looked, it was very much, it was much more on the surface of looking at how much funding, was allocated, how much students were accessing, the number of students who were eligible, how much or the percentage of who were accessing and utilizing. And then the tuition waivers, some states that do have the tuition waiver. So some states like Florida and Texas have long-standing tuition waiver programs, and they've been able to kind of look at how much is used. And those are very underutilized as well for some of the reasons that I mentioned, but other reasons too. Students just have trouble accessing them. There's a lot of red tape and paperwork that goes into it, eligibility requirements and things like that, and it's unfunded. So if institutions aren't benefiting from it in some sort of way, they're not, incentivized to be able to offer these sort of supports to young people. And then other we're just not collecting data. So in Illinois, we don't even collect data around the tuition waiver. We don't know how much students are getting, if they're getting anything, if they're eligible. Or how much is being kind of spent on this program.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, really what types of funding are available is very much state dependent. You can have a youth in state A that has extended foster care, so they can remain in care up to age 21, have their housing paid for or at least partially paid for. The state may have a tuition and fee waiver, so they can go to college, without paying tuitions and fees. Some states have passed laws to fill in gaps of education and training vouchers if there's more youth applying than those that receive it. Really just a robust and also attend colleges, many colleges with our campus support programs, which can also provide things like book vouchers, transportation vouchers, and so forth. May have another young youth in state B that doesn't have extended foster care, no tuition waiver, no campus support programs. And so their financial, what resources are available to them looks very different. So a big part of this depends on which state a young person happens to live on. There's still quite a amount of state by state variability.
What happens if they move states? Does it matter? Do you have to have been in foster care in the state to be eligible?
Sometimes. If a student in, Illinois wants to go to college in California, they don't qualify for the tuition waiver because it's state specific. So, and they may not, qualify for some of the benefits that California students might have, even though they're going to school in California.
Yeah, some states have it where they will, youth are able to attend school out of states. Like this is what the case is in Connecticut. A young person could could enroll in college out of state, but they will pay for in-state tuition cost of a Connecticut university. So if you're out of state, right, it's ×2 in tuition. So we'll only pay for a portion of tuition. So yeah, it does depends on the state, really.
And all of this is depending on whether or not a student even knows that these options exist, right? If you have a good relationship with your caseworker, or if you're working with an advisor at school who has knowledge around resources that are available specifically for young people in foster care. Again, why the coordination is important across sectors, because oftentimes, college advisors on the K-12 higher ed side are not aware of these resources to be able to, deal with some of the informational barriers that young people may experience.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Well, thank you. We're at our time. I know we could keep talking, but thank you so much, Jennifer, Nate, and Royale, for sharing with us your work, your expertise. It's been, again, very informative, and just thank you for joining the webinars. Thanks to all the participants as well. We keep sending out the webinars as they come up, so be on the lookout for them. And thanks, everybody. Have a great weekend.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.